Hello everyone, this is just a quick walkthrough of a past paper question from paper 3 at Edexcel. We're going with the June 2023 paper, and the question is evaluate the likely microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of tax cuts in the UK. So like always with these, I'm going to go with two major topics to answer the question. One of them is going to be microeconomics, one of them is going to be macroeconomics. The microeconomics question here is mainly focused on the effect of higher disposable incomes that result from all of these tax cuts. And then the macroeconomic effect is going to be focused on basically why this would be a driver for economic growth, looking at long-run aggregate supply diagrams. So if we start with the disposable income, I always want to fit two definitions or one definition into my analysis section. So this is generally going to be incorporated within the analysis as the topics come up. Here I've gone with the marginal propensity to consume and with the producer surplus, because those are going to be the topics that I'm going to talk about when I'm discussing the effect of cutting these tax rates. So just when they come up naturally, I'll define those. The analysis here is pretty straightforward. Basically, it's that the lower income and property taxes are going to result in higher disposable incomes for individual people, right? So you're going to be cutting down on how much people are being taxed, and that's going to leave them with more disposable income. The result is that they are going to spend more money on non-essential goods, which should shift demand curves for consumer goods to the right, because you're increasing overall demand for specific types of goods, which allows businesses in turn to set higher prices, gain more profit, and then you could continue to talk about how this is going to affect businesses, both when they have lower tax rates and also when there's higher demand for consumers. In terms of evaluating this, we're just going to use a fairly straightforward supply and demand diagram. You're going to get a rightward shift in demand from demand 1 to demand 2 that's listed here. And I also would draw the producer surplus if we're going to talk about how companies are able to reinvest their producer surplus and increase their productive capacity. So we get this like shaded area, which is PS1, and then you're going to get the amount that it increases by when prices go from P1 to P2 and quantity goes from Q1 to Q2. And then in terms of an evaluation, we want to talk about how much tax cuts are actually going to translate to higher rates of consumption, which in this case would depend on the marginal propensity to consume, which might be influenced by different conditions. Like if you're in a recession, even if you increase the amount of disposable income people have, they may be less willing to spend it because they feel more financially insecure. They're worried about losing their job. So cutting taxes under certain economic conditions might not have a big effect on aggregate demand, but we could also talk about how tax cuts potentially lead to spending cuts, which would then mean that you lose some public services, which might also be a factor in how much overall consumption there is in the economy. So you've got kind of two reasons why potentially tax cuts do not translate to higher aggregate demand. And then for topic B, we are going to talk about aggregate supply and aggregate demand overall. So definitions here, we're looking at aggregate demand, aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply. We're going to end up using a sort of long-run aggregate supply model when we're analyzing this. The analysis, again, fairly straightforward, fairly simple. The government spending is a component of our aggregate demand. So I would define aggregate demand in terms of government spending, investment, net exports. And so we're going to say government spending and consumption. So government spending is a component of that. If we increase government spending effectively by reducing tax cuts, you're increasing net government spending. So that's removing a withdrawal from the circular flow of income, which you can see I've written here. Which will increase aggregate demand. We're also saying, for the reasons we talked about in the previous point, you're going to get an increase in consumption. And we want to make sure we're using the diagrams right. So this is why I've thrown in the removal of the rise in corporate tax rates from 19 to 25%, which will facilitate more corporate investment, which is another component of aggregate demand, which gets us the increase in aggregate supply. And then we're analyzing that through just an ASAD diagram. You can see like in this example, we're looking at a rightward shift in aggregate demand. So you could analyze why that's likely to increase economic growth from YFE to Y2. in this example, we're assuming that the increase in aggregate demand is creating a positive output gap because we're exceeding long-run aggregate supply, which is going to come into our evaluation. So evaluation here is obviously tax cuts are going to reduce government spending. This is the same evaluation we had for the previous point. I wouldn't repeat it, but it's an option here as well. And then the other thing that I might say is this other point, right? The improvements in GDP growth might be limited by the long-run aggregate supply in a classical model. So if we're making an assumption that we're using a classical model here, long-run aggregate supply is effectively the maximum productive capacity in our economy in a situation where we started out more or less close to or at long-run aggregate supply in terms of our equilibrium. If you then increase aggregate demand, you're creating a positive output gap where the demand for goods exceeds our productive capacity. That's at Y2. What is then going to happen in the long run is you're going to put a lot of strain on factors of production because you're trying to exceed basically the capacity of those things in the economy, which causes this leftward shift in short-run aggregate supply, which is why you get a big increase in the price level from P1 to P3. So the argument here is that you might create demand pull inflation as a result of cutting taxes and forcing through this increase in aggregate demand. That is going to depend on where you start out. Do you start out at low-run aggregate supply? Do you start out with a negative output gap, like because you're underperforming as an economy, which possibly is why you would try to pursue the policy of tax cuts. So maybe we are in a negative output gap. So this evaluation very much is a question of what conditions exist in the economy. Like with most things, all of these policies have positive and negative effects, and a lot of it just depends on what state the economy is in when you implement those policies. So that would be the basic analysis and evaluation. In terms of writing a conclusion for this, I'd probably want to provide an overall evaluation of whether or not we think tax cuts are appropriate at this particular moment. We've got a bit of context in our overview. I'll scroll through up here. So we've got a bit of context about consumer inflation, right? So I might say tax cuts are probably not a very sensible decision at this particular point because they're pro-inflationary, which was the evaluation we put forward. And this is a context where there's already a high rate of inflation. So it would make sense to not pursue this as a policy. That would be the conclusion. So I hope this is clear. I hope this is helpful. I would be interested to see how you guys would answer this question. So feel free to comment what your position would be or how you would answer this. And we can discuss those in the comments as well.